we can speak to Han Entzinger. He's a professor of migration and integration at Erasmus University in Rotterdam and joins us now from Nijmegen. Professor Entzinger, thank you for joining us here on TRT World. So the referendum, a bit of a mixed signal, but it does tell us that Hungary doesn't want to try and take any more refugees as part of the EU's spread scheme, does it?
Well, that's true, but we already knew that. So in that respect, the referendum has not really changed the situation. However, I'm not a specialist on Hungarian politics, but it seems to me that even though the turnout was too low to make the referendum legally binding, it could be interpreted as a kind of political victory for the Hungarian prime minister and as a, so to say, defeat, at least as a drawback for the European Union.
Absolutely. And how do you think it will be viewed across Europe, especially in places like France, where there's the rise of the far right, and in other nations that are not at this moment particularly enamoured with the whole European project?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we know from what has happened over the past year that responses to the refugee crisis in Europe have been very, very different from one country to another, but also within countries. It's a very sensitive issue, and I would not be surprised if the populist movements in France, Germany, Netherlands, and a number of other countries would sort of feel, supported by this referendum, because the people have spoken, even though it's not the majority of the population.
Absolutely. Professor, what do you make of this particular vote? I'm not asking you to sort of investigate Hungarian politics, but the feeling across Europe, this anti-refugee feeling. Now, the point of Europe is integration, the point of Europe is people working together. What do you put down this kind of anti-migrant, anti-refugee feeling? And surely, if that feeling is getting stronger, that's a real breakdown of the whole ethos of the European Union.
Well, to a certain extent, yes. It's the litmus test of the European Union almost. There are huge differences in responses, in numbers of refugees, also, of course, accepted by the different member states. And the problem is that if you decide to have a common migration policy, which also includes a common asylum and refugee policy, and you break down the internal borders and barriers, you need to harmonize your policies to a certain extent, but the member states simply cannot agree on this. And at the same time, it's also needed to reinforce the external borders in order to prevent people who have no justified refugee claim to enter the European Union. And even though some reinforcement has taken place, and even though there has been, and there still is, a deal with Turkey, there's still many people entering the European Union, both refugees, but also people who in fact are illegal migrants.
And Professor, with Brexit happening, do you think this could strengthen calls for countries like Hungary to perhaps leave the EU, or more likely, calls for the EU to be reformed in ways that sort of change, as you say, the entire ethos of what it was set up to do?
Yes, well, true. There is dissatisfaction among many member states. Luxembourg has already recommended Hungary to leave the European Union. We have Brexit. We have a number of other countries where certain dissatisfaction has appeared, including my own country, the Netherlands. We had a referendum on Ukraine a few months ago, which was against, ended in a majority for not making commercial links with the Ukraine tighter. So on all fronts, there is some dissatisfaction coming up with the European Union. Perhaps it's going too fast. Yet, on the other hand, it will be very, very difficult to continue without the European Union in this era of globalization. Nations, and particularly the relatively small nations in Europe, are so strongly interlinked that we need some form of cooperation, and that brings benefits, but of course also some things that may not be liked by everyone. And with the recent but the extensions eastwards of the European Union, the mentality and the mentalities have become more different than they were before, and that could explain why there's more tension than there was a couple of years ago when the Union was still smaller than it is right now.
Absolutely. Well, Professor Entzinger from the Erasmus University in Rotterdam, I thank you for joining us on TRT World. Thank you.